Our learning today should be a zchus for hopefully peace. Oh, that's not Blue Jays. Those are the Toronto Maple Leafs, no? Okay, so peace and that the Blue Jays should clinch. They can't win. They have to win both games at home. Who's bringing me to the game? I don't know. Okay, are you going to the game? No. It's a lot. It's expensive, the tickets, right? Okay, well, maybe we'll make should we make a learning a goal, and then if we accomplish the goal, then we'll get to go. Okay, so to be decided, but maybe we'll have some sort of learning initiative. So, thank you, David, for the refreshments and the milk. Today's topic is family planning and birth control. If anyone wants to leave to go to an important meeting about potentially putting out a zoning application, they can. Don't worry. You could hear the recording if you need to. But I think it's going to have to be 2 parts here, anyways. But so it's an interesting question. Someone asked me, Rabbi, why you talk about this now? It's too late for me, or whatever. Who's this relevant to? So, first of all, I think it's an interesting topic, even if it's not directly relevant. But also, it's we had in Parshas Bereishis, and we're going to see again in Noach, the mitzvah Puravu, and it's a mitzvah. It's something to learn about and to understand the parameters of the mitzvah from a Talmud Torah perspective, and potentially from a practical perspective, depending on everyone's personal situation. So, just to begin, there's a fascinating editorial note in the RJJ Journal in 1982, before of Herschel Schechter's article, Halachic Aspects of Family Planning. The editors wrote a editorial note, and they wrote as follows. In order to be certain that our journal falls well within the parameters of the halacha, it was decided from the outset that all articles published herein would receive the scrutiny of Gedolei Yisrael. Not mentioning who they are, but apparently there are Gedolim looking at this journal. In a discussion last year with one of the outstanding Rosh Yeshiva regarding certain articles for inclusion in the journal, we were strongly urged by him to print an article on Miniat HaHerayon, birth control. Not only did this Gadol request this article, but he also specifically requested that it include all heterim available, all allowances. His feeling was that it is important for people to have knowledge so they will be able to approach their Rav for advice. Doesn't mention who this Gadol is, but the rumors are in NYU, which it's fascinating, the RJJ Journal, it's gone through many iterations, but most of the people who write in the RJJ Journal are from YU, even though it was published by RJJ and in coordination with Marvin Schick, who everyone, maybe you haven't heard about him, but he was a big Askan, and was involved in many different organizations. A good Torah Masorah. Meir's father probably, I imagine your father knows more about the whole history of the RJJ Journal, how that the school got involved with the journal. But either way, it has a wider readership than just the YU world. But for whatever reason, maybe because they know how to write, they want to write. Many of the Rosh Yeshiva and the different Talmidim at YU wrote for the RJJ Journal and were editors for the journal. Not all of them, but many of them. So, as I was saying, the rumor on the street at YU is that it was Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky who asked that this article be written, even though they didn't name him in this journal. And Rav Schechter wrote this article about 40 years ago. He makes a few points, just I thought it was important to note at the outset, that this is not usually a topic discussed in a public forum. He writes, Halacha forbids public lectures on matters of Gilei Arayos, for fear that some of the attendants of such drushos will misunderstand the fine points of the law and do forbidden acts, thinking that they are permissible. Many years ago, Rabbi Feinstein, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, ruled in a responsum that the issue of family planning is included under the broad heading of Arayos, and therefore may not be treated in journals available to the public. So how could he write such an article? He just said he can't publish any articles about it. Nevertheless, over the past 20 years, this topic has been dealt with at length in both public forums and popular journals. Its treatment, unfortunately, has been less than satisfactory, with presentations often being incomplete and inaccurate. Several Gedolim felt that a new halachic paper on this subject in English would be appropriate, and it is upon their insistence that this paper is being written. The halachic issue involved in family planning touched on many areas. This paper will introduce the reader to these various areas without attempting to exhaust the halachic discussions involved. It should be stressed that this essay is not intended to be a source of practical halacha. Each family situation is different, and the questions must be referred to a qualified rabbinic authority. So, with that introduction, I think that we're still, even though it's 40 years later, we still are in the same similar situation. I don't know, I don't have data, I don't know exactly, but I think there is a bit of an ambiguity when it comes to family planning. I think people do know that they have to ask a rabbi, but I don't know how many people are open with the rabbi or maybe feel comfortable being open with the rabbi. And in general, I think there's just lack of understanding in both directions. Maybe people think that there's birth control, you can't do birth control. And by the way, there are certain sects of the Orthodox community that may have different approaches. I will come to you from my own, where I sit. I'm a Talmud of Rav Shechter, Rabbi Willig. I've listened to shiurim by him on this topic. So that's kind of my worldview, although I do know, particularly, I'll say on the record, because he says it publicly, Rabbi Yosef Elephant from the Mir, is very outspoken about the need to space out children. He has a large influence in the more, I guess, yeshiva world, and he speaks for the Aguda often. He does talk about that. I know from anecdotally, I can't prove this, I don't know, I'm not an expert in Chabad, but I believe Chabad is on the other side of the spectrum. I think they're very anti-birth control. But I will tell you, just from where I stand, and from my Rebbeim, and try to, as I always do, try to share the sources with you so that you can make your own informed decision and understand what is, what's the shaila to be asked in everyone's personal situation. Does anyone have any particular areas they want me to try to address, more than others, or anyone want to? Because it's a big topic. Because I saw we could talk about, can someone fulfill Peruvu with IVF? Can someone enter a marriage on birth control? That's one topic that I plan to get to. I'm not sure if it will be today. Second marriages. There's certain people who can't have children. Can you marry them? There's all these different types of questions that are relevant. So if anyone wants to specifically ask a question now, I could try to see if we could sort of go in that direction or not. No? Okay, just general knowledge. Everyone wants to know the general perspective. So I mentioned before that the reason why I'm picking this topic is that we're after Parshas Bereishis and next week's Parshas Noach, and or this week is Parshas Noach, and the mitzvah of Puruvu comes up a number of times. It's actually mentioned in 3 different places. The Mefarshim try to deal with why it's mentioned a number of times. We're going to see one comment of the Meshech Chochmah, which I think is fascinating, where he deals with this repeat, but it's repeated, I found 3 different times. You could see on the source sheet in source number 2, in Bereishis Perek Aleph, Pasuk Chaf Ches, V'yivarech Osam Elokim Vayomer Lahem Elokim Peru Urevu Umulu Ha'aretz. Right here seems to be a blessing, not necessarily a command, but it could be it's a command. We'll have to see. Then we have populate the world, V'chivshua, and conquer it. We'll have to see what that means also. Who's doing the conquering? Who is required? Who's obligated in the mitzvah of Puruvu? Is it men? Is it women? Then we have in Perek Tes, Pasuk Aleph, in Parshas Noach, V'yivarech Elokim es Noach v'es banav. Hashem does it again. He blesses them. V'yomer lahem Puruvu mulu ha'aretz. Maybe because after the flood, they have to be reminded again. Perek Tes, Pasuk Zayin, V'atem Puruvu shirtzu v'aretz uruvu va. So 3 times the Torah says Puruvu. It's the first mitzvah, and is determined by many of the Mefarshim as a mitzvah rabbah. It's a great mitzvah. It's very important. I'll just tell you, we're not up to this topic yet, maybe next week, but there are many different treatments that require injections when it comes to IVF and other things. and it comes up as a shaila, is a person allowed to do it on Shabbos? So Rav Willig says, many people look at it and they try to say, well, maybe they're weak, women are weak, and they're having all these hormonal treatments, so maybe they're like a chola. He says, no. Totally different heter. Mitzvah rabbah. It's a very important mitzvah. That gives a lot of leeway when it comes to doing things on Shabbos, when you would not necessarily allow it, because it's a very important mitzvah. So that's jumping way ahead, but that's just to give you a perspective that it's a very important mitzvah. Also, Rav Shechter says this all the time, Puruvu is not just the literal, well, as we'll talk about today, literally trying to have children or birthing children, or it's also about raising the children, bringing them up, keep teaching them Torah. Someone asked in the group, if we don't have, maybe we're beyond the age of having children, maybe this isn't relevant. It's relevant because raising children in the derech HaTorah is part of Puruvu. It's part of bringing the children through not just physical life, but bringing them up, raising them, and now, many people, Baruch Hashem, have our grandparents. It's raising the children, raising the next generation. It's all included in the mitzvah Puruvu. That's why, according to Rav Shechter, and he quoted a number of Mefarshim, which we're not going to get to necessarily today, but that's one of the reasons that Rav Shechter says you're allowed to push off Puruvu for Talmud Torah. As we'll soon see, how could you say that? You can't just push off mitzvos for learning. So according to some, it's because the whole purpose of having children is to raise them in the derech of Torah, and that's all part of the mitzvah, and therefore potentially, if it's legitimate, which we'll have to see, there are certain times one can delay doing the mitzvah if that is required for Talmud Torah. But there's another two places in Tanakh where we have this mitzvah mentioned, which the Mefarshim and the Poskim quote. And whenever we have nach psukim, we have to understand, what is this? It's not a mitzvah daraisa, obviously. Is it a mitzvah midrabanan? Is it what is it exactly? So we'll have to see. But there's two different mitzvahs referred to generally as sheves. It's a pasuk in Yeshaya. Oftentimes the poskim refer to it as the mitzvah of sheves. Where does that come from? Because the pasuk says, Lo tohu vara lasheves yitzara ani Hashem ve'in ohod. Hashem did not create the world to be wasted. He created it to be for habitation, formed it for habitation. I am Hashem, and there's no other God. So l'sheves yitzara. And another pasuk, which is quoted in the poskim, fascinating, pasuk in Koheles. Pasuk in Koheles, which, you never read the pasuk as a halacha, but the poskim quote it in halacha, and that is ula erev, not ula erev vayer vayvoker, but ula erev al tanoch yadecha. So let's read the whole pasuk. It's in Koheles Perek Yud Aleph, pasuk vav, and by the way, in Yeshaya it was mem he yud ches. Perek mem he pasuk yud ches. In Koheles the pasuk is baboker zira es zarecha. In the morning, seed your sow. V'lo arev, and in the evening, al tanach yadecha, do not hold your hand back. What does that mean? It's interpreted to, you could, the way the pasuk is read, it doesn't seem to be anything about having children. But the way that poskim understand it, and Mefarshim understand it, is that at night you shouldn't stop trying to have children, you shouldn't stop to procreate. So even if you've already fulfilled the mitzvah Puruvu, we'll see there are other mitzvos, other psukim that encourage, the way poskim understand, encourage us to continue having children. And in general, there is obviously a kiyum ha-mitzvah, maybe I shouldn't say obvious, there is a kiyum ha-mitzvah, a fulfillment of the mitzvah every child one has, even if you've already fulfilled the mitzvah Puruvu, as we'll soon see is a debate what that definition is. But even once you've reached that point, if you have another child, that's obviously a mitzvah. Having another child is a kiyum, a fulfillment of Puruvu. So, first of all, who is required in the mitzvah of Puruvu? It takes two to tango. You need a man and a woman. But it's interesting, most poskim side with the Rambam, and we'll see it comes from a Gemara and a Mishnah, that the man is required and not the woman. So let's see where that comes from. And it has to do with that pasuk we mentioned, the chivshua. So the Gemara in Yevamis, it's really a Mishnah, but Gemara in Yevamis is Samach Hamid Beis. Mishnah says, Ha'ish mitzuva al pur v'rivya, avalo ha'isha. The first opinion, Tanakama, says that a man is obligated. As we mentioned, it takes two to tango, but who is required? The man. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Broga disagrees, and he says, Al Shneim Omer, the pasuk refers to both man and woman, because it says, Vayivarech Osam Elokim, Vayomer Lahem. God said to both man and woman, Peru Revu. So, what is the source for the Tanakama who we paskin like? You know, immediately, where do they get their information? Where their sources from? That's what the Gemara asks. Amar Rabbi Ilah Mishum Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon Amar Kra Muluas Haaretz V'chiv Shuha. After Puravu, it says you fill the land and you conquer it. Fascinating. The Gemara tells us that based on those words, that is why a man is required. Why? Because Ish Darko Lechabesh, V'in Isha Darka Lechabesh. It's the man's nature to conquer and not the woman's nature to conquer. So that means that when the Torah refers to V'chiv Shuha, it means it's referring to the man, which means that the previous language of the pasuk refers to only the man. And that's in fact how the Rambam paskins in Hilchos Ishus, Perek Tesvav Halacha Beis. It's interesting, we'll get back to this, but in Halacha Aleph, the Rambam does have an important phrase, maybe we'll come back to it in part 2, but the Rambam seems to say that the act of intercourse, is the fulfillment, is the Ma'aseh Mitzvah of Puravu, but that has to do with a different topic. The Shulchan Aruch rules like that Rambam that Ha'isha Mitzvah al Purav Rivya, the Rambam literally says Lo Ha'isha, and that's exactly what the Shulchan Aruch writes in Even HaEzer, Aleph Yud Gimel, Isha Ina Mitzvah al Pura V'Rivya. The Meshech Chochmah, as I mentioned before, has a fascinating explanation of this, where he basically asks the question, like, why is this? Obviously, if a woman is required for the process here, at least it's, nowadays we have ways of creating outside, let's say in a lab, in a petri dish, but generally the normative way to have children is with a man and a woman. But so why is a woman not required by the Torah to have children? And also we notice that women want much more, generally speaking, not always, but often women have a greater desire to have children than men. So the Meshech Chochmah fascinatingly explains. Lo rachuk hulomar, source number 10. And this is in Bereshis Tes, Parak Tes, Pasuk Zayin. He says it's not very far-fetched to say, doesn't say like straight up, but it's not far-fetched to say the following, that why is she patra a Torah nashim? Why does the Torah exempt women, mipru revu, v'chayva rak an nashim, and only requires man? Ki mishpatei Hashem udrachav darkei noam v'chol nesivosei shalom. He quotes a pasuk in Mishlei that all of the paths of the Torah, all of its ways are pleasant, and its ways are of peace. And Hashem didn't require of the Jew that which is the body is unable to fulfill. And he goes on to say that every davar asur, everything that's forbidden, has a allowed way to be done. And he gives certain examples and goes in a little bit of a different direction. And he says another source is Lo Dibra Torah Ela Keneged Yitzhara, that the Torah addresses the base desires of man. So, for example, he says Moshe Rabbeinu was the only one who was seemingly at some point asked to separate from his wife, but there's never a requirement of other people to do that. And then he says we find that there's this Even Pina, a foundational idea for the Avos HaKabbalah, for those who lay down our laws or our traditions, that they said that a woman is pater miyibam. She's pater from yibam if her husband dies and then her children die. Why is that? Because of darkei noam, derachera darkei noam, v'imkein, and because of this, nashim shemistaknos beibor v'leida, women who are at risk when they are pregnant and they give birth, They are not required, and he says, Mishum zeh amru misa shchicha, and it's common that women would die in childbirth, certainly in those days. And since it's not unheard of, even today, we have our medical advancements are such that it's certainly not, I would say, I don't want to say it's not dangerous. It's obviously, it's an intense experience, but in terms of the statistics, we're in a much better place than we were. But perhaps this is still relevant, that the Torah would not require, this does not require a woman to put herself in danger to fulfill the mitzvah of Puruvu. In other words, if the Torah, yes, obviously there has to be a woman involved, but the Torah can't require her, because if it would, then it is forcing someone to do something which is difficult. It's even if you want to, let's say, in ancient times it was dangerous, but let's say even nowadays it's difficult and it puts her at risk on some level. There are more high-risk pregnancies and lower-risk pregnancies, but it's still something that is difficult, and the Torah is not going to require something which is difficult for a person. But then he says, Rak lakim hamin, but for the establishment, the continuation of the species, you have to have women, even though they're not required, but Hashem created in the world that there's this desire, asa betiva, Hashem put it in a woman's nature, shetshukasa laholid azah mishal ish, that her desire to have children, to bear children, is greater than a man's desire. And he says, we see this by Rachel, that she says, if I don't have children, then I want to die. I want to die now. Havali banim ve'im ayin misa anochi. Men, this is a generalization, but men generally don't feel the same desire to have children. So Hashem put it into the very nature of women to want to have children more than man, but who's required? The man's required. So they have this interesting phenomenon that he says, because of derechera darchei noam, that the Torah's ways are pleasant, it can't require a woman, but it puts into their nature a greater desire. Fascinating. Okay. So what is the requirement, now that we've seen who is Mitzvah generally, there are other shitos. There's a Ran that says, since women are required to assist men, so maybe they have some sort of obligation, but generally speaking, the man is not, the man is required, the woman's not. Obviously the woman gets a mitzvah of Puruvu, and obviously she's in part of the process, but she's not obligated. So now that we've defined who is obligated, what is the obligation? So this also is a Mishnah in Yevamis, quoted in the Gemara as well, but the Mishnah is in Parak Zayin, Mishnah Vav. It says as follows: Lo yibatel adam bepirya v'rivya, ela imkein yesh labanim. A man may not neglect the mitzvah. Interesting language. Yibatel. He's not allowed to neglect it or violate it or nullify it unless he has children. So seemingly, even if he has children, there's some act of nullification of some level. But he's not allowed to do that unless he has children. How many children? Beis Shammai omrim shnei zecharim. Beis Shammai says 2 males. Beis Hillel omrim zachar unakeva, a boy and a girl. Shenemar zachar unakeva bira'am. Now this is a minimum requirement. Now, one could say it's not really in my hands. I don't decide how many children that I have. So, we'll get to that. We'll get to, I guess, part of that, but not necessarily all of it. But a person has an obligation to attempt to do the best that they can to fulfill the mitzvah. The next part of the Mishnah, it says, what is the application of this, or another application of that, besides the knowledge of trying to have a boy and a girl? Nasa isha v'shah ima eser shanim. Let's say a person gets married for 10 years, v'lo yalda, and they don't have any children. She doesn't give any birth to any children. Eino rishai libatel. he cannot, or he's not allowed to neglect the mitzvah of Puruvu, and Girsha Muteras Linasi Lacher. He has to either divorce her or marry someone else. This is talking about prior to Takana Rabbeinu Gershom, where you have to, you can't marry more than one wife. The Mishnah says he could divorce her and he's allowed to marry somebody else.
I mean, after the Chaim.
Sorry?
After, not before. But before.
10 years. This is, he says,
no, you said,
two options. Girsha, you could divorce her, or Muteras Linas Vacher. You could marry someone else without divorcing her. Okay. I'm skipping a little ahead. As the Mishnah says, Ha'isha Metzuva Purva Rivya Avalo Ha'isha. As we learned before, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka disagrees with that, but we paskin like the Chachamim. Okay. What about? So I mentioned you try your best, but what's a person can't? Or let's say they had one child. Is one child a fulfillment of Puruvu? Let's say the woman says, I had one child and I'm done. I can't do anymore. And we're post Takana Rabbeinu Gershom. So a person can't divorce his wife against her will, and he can't marry another woman. And he wants to have more children. And she says, no, I had one, I'm done. One and done. Different kind of one and done. So he's stuck. So we'll see, Rav Willig holds that the woman wins in both directions. She wins when she's, in other words, she doesn't, let's say she wants to have more, she wins. If she wants to only have one, it seems to be that Rav Willig holds that she wins as well. So we'll have to see why that is. In both directions, the woman says, I don't want any more children, or she says, I want more children, and the husband disagrees. So where does he get this from? So it's an interesting source. It seems to be pretty creative because it comes from a netziv commenting on a she'iltos. The she'iltos asked the question, what if you only have one child? The she'iltos de Rav Achai Gon, Kuf Samachei Beis. What if you just have one child? What is that? Is that a fulfillment of the mitzvah of Puruvu? And the Netziv has a commentary called the Ha'emek Sheila, and he comments on this, and he has a long piece. I don't have time to go through the whole thing, but he has a long piece there where he says that there's also, we mentioned this before, the mitzvah of Sheves, the Sheves Yitzara. What is the mitzvah of Sheves? To be populating the world, and that is only one child. So the Netziv says that Pru, Ravu, and Sheves work together. Seem to be the fulfillment of the mitzvah mi'ikra adin according to the Netziv. The way Rav Willig reads this, they're b'habah talia, they're dependent on each other, and the requirement would be one child. According to Rav Nassim in Yavamis, this is even in the Shita of Beis Hillel, he says one child is enough because of the fulfillment of Sheves. How could that? So therefore what? Sheves is a pasuk in Yeshaya. It's not the pasuk of Puruvu. It seems to be, according to the way Rav Willig reads this Netziv, that Sheves is the basic definition requirement of Puruvu. He says here, Lo kamar lo nivra olam elo li yishuv ha'olam el Puruvu hi yishuv ha'olam. Puruvu is defined by the mitzvah of Yishuv Ha'olam, which is Sheves, which means fundamentally, minimally, one child is a fulfillment of Sheves. Okay. So, on some level, if a person had even one child, and they are sort of fulfilled of the mitzvah of Puruvu. So why should a person have more than one child? As we mentioned, there's other psukim that are mentioned. La'arev al tanach yadecha. Every fulfillment of the mitzvah Puruvu is another mitzvah. But on a very fundamental ikr level, one child seems to be enough. Now, let's say if a person it seems to be, they should have more. Do we impress upon him, or do we try to force him to do this? It seems to be in previous years, there was more of a socially acceptable pressure, or it seems to be the shoftim and shotrim, they would actually be kofin alav, they would force people to do things. But the Beis Shmuel quotes from the Ramban, ein kofin oso l'kuli alma, that when it comes to the mitzvah of l'erev al tanach yadecha, we don't force it, it's not enforceable. It's yishuv derech eretz. Although it seems to be the Rambam has other language that it seems to be the Rambam says it's a mitzvah midrabanan, it's a mitzvah midivrei sofrim, something along those lines. According to the Ramban, it's maybe even of a lower level. Do you want me to hold it here so that people can go to the meeting? Is that, yeah? Okay. So there's more.
part two. We're up to part two.
I should keep going.
No, we're up to part two.
You're up to part two.
Yeah, there's a new part which is, let's say, spacing children or birth control, but that we've gotten to a certain point which I think would be, it's okay to stop. Okay? Yeah? Okay. All right, Rabbosai, have a great day, a great week, and enjoy. All the best.